Hello, and welcome to this video blog on the Turkey-Syria earthquake response. It's been brought to you by disasterwise.org, a web platform I designed at the beginning of the year for those who want to know more about myths, maths, and management of disaster. 10 days into the response, I thought it might be useful to explain what's really been going on behind the scenes and to point out where some of the immediate challenges going forward might lie. My name's James Shepherd-Barron. I'm a disaster risk management consultant, and I've got over 30 years experience of operating on policy at headquarters level and in the field, coordinating disaster responses around the world. The views I go on to express here are entirely my own. Let's get one thing clear from the outset. Naturally occurring hazards like earthquakes are inevitable, but the disasters they spawn are almost entirely optional. We know who's most likely to die in a disaster, those who are poor and who have little, if any, agency over where and how they live. And we know how to protect them. So why, when we know all these things, do we allow disasters to keep on happening? This question is going to be asked more and more loudly in Turkey and in northern Syria over the months to come. This disaster was always an accident waiting to happen, but it was, of course, no accident. Disasters are what happen when natural phenomena or man-made hazards collide with human behavior to disrupt and temporarily overwhelm local coping capacities. Disasters are not divine tragedies ordained by capricious gods, but social constructs, the product of interactions between different types of hazards and historical, social, and political forces. They are processes, not events, and they're long-term processes at that, the result of decades of accumulated risk interacting with vulnerable communities ill prepared to cope with or adapt to the emerging realities of shifting political ideology or climate change. In this sense, disasters are caused by vulnerability, not hazard, and are therefore essentially political acts based on deliberate decisions we as a society choose to take or not take. There is very little that is natural about a natural disaster. But hey, we have to be realistic. The fact is that our political leaders, especially those voted into power on short-term election cycles, don't find it politically expedient to spend taxpayers' money on preventing something that, on the balance of probability, is unlikely to happen on their watch. At the same time, they love a disaster, as it affords them the opportunity to look like they're indispensable. We saw that with COVID. And if someone falls over a cliff and dies, you'll always find the politician with the fleet of blue light ambulances and TV crews at the foot of the cliff. You'll never find them at the meeting held months earlier to discuss whether or not to erect a fence at the top, which would have prevented the accident from happening in the first place. What then determines when a hazard event becomes a disaster? Well, unfortunately, there is a cold, hard calculus to calamity. And I'll go through this very quickly now. The R, B, and H in this integrated disaster risk reduction model refer respectively to risk, that is, the perception that populations potentially exposed have towards disaster. Those living in the affected area knew full well that they were living in a seismic active zone. The beta refers to their behavior, and particularly in an earthquake response, do they know how to respond when the shaking starts? Many people get injured, for example, when running out of the building from falling masonry. So their behavior has some direct implication on who dies and who gets injured. The H refers to the hazard, and in this case, the type of hazard. Earthquakes, sadly, are the most dangerous of all types of disaster. although actually floods and droughts kill more people overall. They're also a function of magnitude and intensity. They're not quite the same thing, but basically intensity is a measure of energy unleashed at the surface and for how long. And the longer the shaking, the more likely buildings are to collapse. This one, the shaking lasted for about 45 seconds, which is quite long, but it can go on for two minutes or more. It's quite possible for a brick-built building or a non-reinforced concrete building, or one that has been constructed poorly, to collapse within 45 seconds. Magnitude refers to the area over which the energy unleashed was felt. You then got the location in terms of topography, because some places will feel the seismic wave more than others. And lastly, you've really got timing. Time of day, in this case time of night, 4 a.m. was when this disaster happened, and everybody was asleep in bed, and that's when you get maximum death and injury, because people are not outside as they would be during the day. And also this happened in February, in the middle of winter, where temperatures scarcely get above zero. This part of the model talks about vulnerability, exposure, and resilience. So when you're talking about disaster risk reduction, you're trying to decrease vulnerability and exposure and increase one's coping capacity, having been exposed. And the first thing to think about here is the total number of people exposed. But you've also got to think about the density. Are they living in urban areas or not? You've also got to think about housing typology. When thinking about vulnerability, are there pre-existing social and physical vulnerabilities? Yes, people here were poor, many of them from Kurdish areas in northern Syria, elsewhere in Syria, who've been refugees for years and years, subsisting on the very minimum, and by every stretch of the imagination would be classified as socially vulnerable. They're also, of course, physically vulnerable in terms of nutritional status, vaccination coverage, and this kind of thing. In terms of resilience, the most relevant part here, there are two parts to consider. One is, do people know what to do once the dust has settled? Not just, as this picture shows, how to remove rubble, but do they know what early warning systems could have led them to expect? In Japan, for example, Tokyo has about 80 seconds to respond to the initial warning of an earthquake happening off its northeast coast. This is because primary and secondary waves move at different speeds. Also, once the secondary wave, the more destructive of the two, reaches the affected area, peak shaking could take about 20 seconds to reach maximum intensity. So it does give you some time to get out. And in terms of that resilience, do people have first aid training? Do they know what to do when extracting people from the rubble? And we'll come on to this. But just look at this photograph, people dealing with concrete and rebar and nails and all sorts of debris with their bare hands, with no dust masks, and we don't know what their vaccination status for tetanus is, for example. And the M here refers to coordination and management. This is arguably the greatest risk factor of them all in determining who dies, who doesn't, and why in a disaster. The theta is about value for money and how you allocate resources, and the I is about information and how it is managed. So who is involved in these early hectic days? Sorry for the alphabet soup of acronyms, but these are the people that you're hearing about, and this is just some explanation. AFAD is the Turkish Disaster and Emergency Management Authority. It was set up following the Marmara earthquake in 1999, which marked a turning point in disaster risk management all over the world. This was because that particular disaster clearly demonstrated the need to reform disaster management, coordination, and risk management. And note particularly the distinction between the two terms, disaster and emergency. They're not the same thing. What we're dealing with here is a disaster. You could call it a whole series of large-scale emergencies. But an emergency is normally a sub-national incident which is dealt with by national first light responders, maybe the military, civil defense, that kind of thing. Disaster is altogether overwhelming, overwhelms national capacity, and usually ends up with calls for international support. Clearly, we're in the latter here. But in this regard, the Disaster and Emergency Management Authority introduced a new disaster risk management model, which prioritized Turkey's transition from crisis management to risk management. And so their system is an integrated disaster risk management system. And few countries have anything this sophisticated, let alone the capacities the Turks have set up. Unlike the British, for example, who have no similar structure, even after the debacle of COVID. INSARAG stands for the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group. This is an online resource managed by the UN, and it coordinates international response to search and rescue, all those sniffer dogs and teams with their thermal imagery, etc. It agrees standards and shares best practices. That is well underway by the time you hear about a disaster unfolding on your TV screens. As is the UN Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team, who are mobilized within a couple of hours because they have people on standby for these kind of things. 25 people, pre-selected, pre-trained, who get on a plane and go in for anything up to 25 days to work out where the priorities are and to set up the initial coordination mechanism within an emergency operations center, which in this case is run by AFAD, by the people whose job it is to run such things, the national authority. And the Turks have that capacity, so incoming teams will dock with that. If they don't, and normally there is a parallelism here, the on-site Emergency Operations Coordination Center, the OSOC, will also be established in parallel, but it's very quickly absorbed. By day 10, it will be firmly established. Within 3 or 4 weeks, it will be absorbed into the AFAD system. It also has a virtual OSOC, which you can also look at on the virtual OSOC website, although as with INSARAG, you won't be able to gain access to the detail, but you can see and get an impression of what's going on. EMTs are emergency medical teams. The Brits are particularly good at this, and they were born out of a realization that field hospitals typically arrive rather late and for not offering appropriate services, because what is actually needed are lots of mobile teams who can deal with those who have survived, who do not require extensive surgery and ongoing aftercare. Total building collapses are comparatively rare. Well, clearly not in this case. But there are a few things to realize in general as the politics swirls around corruption and building code compliance and who may or may not have been involved. But 5 to 8 story masonry brick built buildings are more likely to collapse than those which are shorter or taller. This is because taller buildings are likely to be better constructed out of ferro concrete with shear walls and torsional flexibility, and really tall buildings, skyscrapers, are built on shock absorbers and dampers which help them dampen the lateral oscillations. Brick built buildings have fewer void spaces, so that when they collapse, less likely to find people inside them. Now, I mentioned building code compliance. Most of the 5,600 buildings that collapsed in Turkey were either built before the year 2000 or were not built to code. That's clear. New building regulations introduced by Ankara after the 1999 earthquake that I talked about before in Marmara have been patchily enforced at best, and nor were older buildings required to retrofit to comply. In fact, a National Earthquake Strategy and Action Plan published in 2012 said breakneck migration to low-quality urban housing in the 1950s meant that large portions of the Turkish population were still critically vulnerable. And sadly, they were still by 2023. This issue will rumble on and have major political ramifications in a country which is due to hold a general election in May, in a few months' time. How do people actually die in an earthquake? This is more scientific than you might think, but not so when you recognize that the media fixates on the numbers of dead, but that's a rather poor indicator of what's actually going on, especially as the search and rescue phase gives way to the response phase, where professional disaster risk management professionals have to start using public health metrics such as disability adjusted life years to measure impact rather than death, which is too crude. One of the ways of coming up with the initial estimates, however, is the use of mobile phones, because the rate at which the phone signal decays will allow you to estimate a mortality which you later corroborate with field reports as they come in, flyovers, and analysis of satellite imagery and footage from drones and what have you. This is pretty accurate nowadays, but I haven't heard any mention of it in the media, and this is likely to be how most of the data that becomes the official figure at day 10, 41,000 people, gets to be put together. I'll just run through some of the most likely causes of death. There are three types: primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary effects, those that occur during the earthquake itself, about 85% of anyone caught in a collapsed building, especially a pancaked building, ferroconcrete, total collapse, are dead within 15 minutes. The vast majority of these die from blunt trauma or blood loss, and then it could be a secondary effect or a primary effect. Many die and are injured from falling masonry, roof tiles, and such like when running outside. But within affected buildings, secondary effects, for those later found dead but uninjured, the cause of death is mostly dust inhalation, hypothermia, or dehydration. A collapsed building generates a lot of heat, which means that even when it's snowing up above, the immediate threat, only for the first few days, is not freezing to death and not hypothermia. That will tend to come by day 3 in most cases. I think the longest earthquake survivor was buried for 76 days in Pakistan, but she had food and a water supply. But all of this means that search and rescue begins to taper off, with teams leaving by about day 8, in the winter that is, and by day 14, normally around day 12, urban search and rescue is normally called off around day 12 to 14, and was in eastern Turkey a few decades ago, after which you cannot expect to find more than the odd miracle. It's a ghastly thing to have to decide, but there is precedent, there is epidemiological data that points to day 12 being the day that you move from search and rescue to relief and recovery. Secondary effects that we can expect to see more of and more comment about: burns, as survivors try to keep warm, particularly using kerosene. We will see many more burn injuries. And fire is a hazard in its own right after a disaster, but mercifully not much sign of that in this particular earthquake, not in terms of number of people dying, that is, although smoke does have an effect on public health over time. More immediate are the spinal injuries which accrue when extricating people from the rubble. The spaces are small. There is not much scope for finesse, but just to point out that spinal injuries don't have to happen, in the same way that crush injuries don't have to result in avoidable death 2 or 3 days after people are extricated. I'm not going to go through any of the medical stuff because I'm not a medical doctor, but spinal injuries and crush injuries, if first responders know about these things and know about how to use spinal boards, you can see in this picture that they don't particularly, and know that crush injury can be treated before septic shock kills those pulled from the rubble, the better. I mentioned earlier a photograph about people dealing with debris with their bare hands. Tetanus can become a major disaster in its own right in an earthquake response, but it depends largely on whether people have had a tetanus inoculation or not. So that's one of the first things you do, is make sure that people who are scrabbling in the rubble to release loved ones have a tetanus shot. Not so common in this part of the world, but especially in Southeast Asia, is the use of asbestos in building construction, and asbestosis by people who are scrabbling in the rubble that's not damped down and they're not wearing a mask will become a major problem in 20 or 30 years' time. And I finally should mention the suicide rate, because we often forget about the mental health problems which over years that follow can cause just as many deaths indirectly as happened in the earthquake event itself. Let me now just run through some of the key challenges I see looming in the days and weeks to come in terms of disaster management. The first concerns who makes the decisions, who's in charge, and who decides what the priorities are. This is clearly what coordination is all about. And I talked earlier about AFAD. The Turks have arguably the most sophisticated disaster risk management system of them all. Suffice to say that decision making is by them. It is their country, it is their people. It is not by the UN. Everything the international community does is to slot in this case, to the national structure and system. Decision making and prioritization is informed by a whole raft of evaluations and needs assessments, for example, of markets, of multi-impact needs assessments of sanitation, for shelter, that go on through the course of at least this month. Actually, they never really stop. The first of which was done by the UNDAC team that I referred to earlier, and has resulted in just today, on day 10 of the disaster response, a flash appeal being launched by the UN, and in which priorities are outlined at least for the next 30 days. And through the course of the next 30 days, more integrated and in-depth assessments will go on, and then regularly thereafter there will be lots of evaluations to check that course correction is or is not needed. From day one, resources have been mobilised. I talked about how the system mobilises urban search and rescue teams and what have you. But in terms of money, then this is largely what the UNDAC team is there to assess. Suffice to say that in the meantime, the good people of the UK and the US and elsewhere will be making their own donations. All I would counsel here is just be aware, because most people seem not to be aware. When they ask me, they seem not to be aware that their money in their form of their taxes goes to a lot of the UN agencies and even some of the big non-governmental organizations from government donation. Their taxes, you have already given your money through taxes. You do not need to give it again to UN agencies, even though they are seeking voluntary funding. And the other thing to mention is that donations which are not solicited, mostly in kind, whether drugs or clothing or what have you, end up never being used. They are dirty, they bring in bugs which are for susceptible people is not a good idea. They arrive in the summer when they're actually for the winter. A whole lot of shoes are inappropriate. A lot of donations are inappropriate and require an enormous amount of resource to get rid of, especially drugs, which arrive with labeling that's in a foreign language or that have a time life, an expiry date, which is, if not exceeded, shortly about to be exceeded, and just have to be destroyed. And all of this is a drain on time, money, and effort in the field. I don't want to make too much of the program challenges because that's a whole series of vlogs on their own. Just to say that people scrambling around with bare hands without masks, dealing with concrete dust and rubble is bad enough in terms of what I talked about before, asbestosis, tetanus and the like. But what are the environmental implications of the management of this solid waste? Who's picking it up? Where is it being moved to? And what happens next? So this is massive in its own right. And in the Pakistan earthquake response, foreign militaries came in and started dumping it in the rivers and what have you. This is not the way to proceed. This is a technical challenge all of its own. There'll be many, many more to do with thermal protection, emergency and transitional shelter, water sanitation, hygiene promotion. But let's see, this is where the effort will now be focusing. Turkey's market will have been just as badly affected as anywhere else, including in northern Syria, where the market didn't function properly anyway. But markets will bounce back given a chance. And in a country as sophisticated as Turkey, the markets will be accessible very, very quickly. Therefore, the argument that says you need to bring in external assistance in the form of what the market can provide, food, for example, after soup kitchens have done their job, and they are important right now, give people cash because they will not waste it. They will spend it on their priorities. Who are we to explain to them what their priorities are? And so let the market rebound. Let's not disrupt that rebound. Let's make sure they have the credit that they need, that the wholesalers have lines of credit guaranteed by governments and all this kind of thing. And let this become the focus very quickly. Be wary of mobilizing in-kind donations for too long. Civil-military cooperation can always be a challenge, especially when you're on the edges of a conflict zone, as we are here. Suffice to say that the military are extremely good at opening up access with their ability to build bridges, literally, not metaphorically, and to mobilize helicopters. And these resources are needed. They're needed from day one to evacuate trauma patients to hospitals in unaffected areas. And when I talk about civil military, we should also be talking about sort of quasi-parastatals, paramilitary, if you like, in the form of civil defense. Family reunification has been going on since day one. There's nothing more heart-wrenching than finding children who simply can't remember the names of any of their family members, let alone know whether they're alive. So massive effort, usually undertaken by the Red Cross, Red Crescent, Kizilay in this case in Turkey, will be underway already. Allied to this is all sorts of initiatives to do with child protection, trafficking and illegal adoptions. This can happen very quickly. It became a major problem within 10 days in the Haiti earthquake response. Active measures have to be taken by those in charge to make sure that doesn't happen. And sexual gender-based violence, SGBV, is also a common response. It's a psychological response that ends up with physical violence. Efforts have to be made to make sure that that is recognized for what it is and that it will not be tolerated. So all sorts of protection issues, including the use of police forces, need to be thought about and are being thought about right now. We're all too painfully aware now that the digital world that we move in is as prone to promulgating disinformation as it is meaningful information. And this doesn't change in a disaster. There are plenty of people who, for whatever reason, misinform people. Sometimes it's to make sure that they get a disproportionate share of the aid to come. Sometimes it's just out of malicious intent, but it does happen, has to be managed. It can be managed from far away. It does not have to be managed on site particularly. And there are plenty of volunteer resources who work on making sure that only moderated content gets through to the decision makers. And just a quick word on the phase to come, because the response phase is only just now beginning to gear up, and it will last for at least 6 months. The early recovery phase has already begun. Rubble removal is an example of early recovery. What to do with the recovered materials, how to use them in rebuilding, etc. Reconstruction comes much later. It can take a couple of years for the World Bank and others to work out exactly how much money is required and what's going to happen. But just to say that in the Kobe earthquake in Japan, a sophisticated country, it took 12 years to finally resettle and rehouse everybody affected by their earthquake. It does not take 12 months, it takes 12 years. And in concluding, just to say that everything you've heard me talk about so far are my own views, which have been born of experience, bitter experience in many cases. Data that I've talked about, the references for these can be found in my book, Absolute Disasters. You can just go to Amazon or the disasterwise.org link. If you have any questions, you can get hold of me the same way, i.e. by using the contact form at disasterwise.org. I hope you found these insights useful, and if I get enough positive feedback, I'll do another of these in 10 days or so and see how we're getting on. Okay, good luck wherever you are, and we are all thinking of everybody who is involved with and has been affected by this dreadful calamity. Goodbye.